So those are the quick announcements, but let me get to what, for me, is the highlight of the evening. When we were looking for and putting together the idea of our keynote addresses, one of the first things that many people at the institution who have been here longer than I have been said was, you need to get somebody from Elon University. And I went, okay, all right, good advice. You don't ask, you don't say why, you just simply say absolutely. But in a serious vein, when our university instituted our student engagement transcript about 7 or 8 years ago, Elon was one of the universities that we modeled what we wanted to do. Because of what they had done with student engagement and engaged learning and service learning, but also because not only did they essentially establish a bar, but they've been very comfortable trying to raise that bar a little bit each year. And so we are absolutely tickled to be able to have one of the people at the Center for Engaged Learning at Elon with us. Her name is Dr. Jessie Moore. A couple of you may have met her at the reception here a few seconds ago. She's the Associate Director at the Center for Engaged Learning at Elon University, and she's also an Associate Professor of English there. So Dr. Connie Ruzick, who also is an English faculty member, you two will eloquently, some other fancy word that I can't think of, eloquently talk. There you go. You need something more melodious than that, though, don't you? Bond. Oh, I thought you said talk. Okay, no problem. Dr. Moore has been at Elon since 2004. Her responsibilities at the Center for Engaged Learning include planning and assessing its research seminars. Her teaching, scholarship, and service encompass professional writing and rhetoric, high-impact learning practices, writing studies, second language writing, teaching English to speakers of other languages, and faculty development. And obviously, when she has a chance to breathe, she hops on an airplane and flies to Pittsburgh to meet us. So, Dr. Moore, thank you for coming up to speak to us, and the floor is all yours. You bet.
So thank you for having me here. It really is a pleasure to come. And that sounds like an odd and lengthy list of research interests, but really at the heart of it is engaged learning practices. If you were to look at what I actually do in those research areas, it centers around service learning, internships, transfer of learning, those types of things. So this has really been the heart and soul of my professional identity. I feel very fortunate to work at Elon University. What you see here are 4 pictures of just a few of our engaged learning practices. We do require students to have 2 experiential learning requirements completed as a graduation requirement. They can pick from 5 different options, and you'll hear about those 5 from a student a little bit later in my presentation. But they are just a central part of our curriculum and something that is central to our university mission. The ones that you see here, we've got going from left to right, and study abroad experience, students presenting their undergraduate research experience, students conducting undergraduate research, and then the last one actually combines study abroad and service learning. It is a study abroad service learning course. So just to get us thinking about some of the things that I'll be talking about today. I do have some notes that I'm going to use just to keep on time so that I don't keep you here too late. But as I've been talking with some of you tonight, I realize that there are parts that I'm going to want to adapt a little bit too. So if I'm pausing and on the fly, that's why. I really want this to be more tailored to who's in the room. So to start that and to get us thinking about what we're here to focus on, I wanted to share David Thornton Moore's definition of effective engaged learning pedagogies, or his description of them. He wrote a 2013 book called Engaged Learning in the Academy, Challenges and Possibilities. And he talks about these pedagogies as being things that induce the learner to look carefully at her experience, to question her own assumptions, to place the experience in relation to larger institutional and societal processes and discourses, to hear others' voices, to grapple with the question of why things happen the way they do, to imagine how things might be different, to read her experience in terms given by major social theories, and to critique those theories from the perspective of her experience. Oh, sure. Thank you.
No problem.
There's a note here that says do not touch microphones, so I was hesitant to do that. But since Anthony did it, then it works.
You guys won't see me tomorrow.
So, and at Elon, we are fortunate that this is really a central part of our mission, this conception of engaged learning. One thing I'll note is you'll notice that this actually comes near the end of his book, on pages 201 and 202. Early in the book, he actually admits that he's not sure that even though engaged learning has the potential to be a transformative experience for students, he's not sure that institutions should necessarily try to enact it across the board unless they can do it well. And what he essentially notes is that it's very challenging, it's very time consuming, and so unless you can make the commitment to really do it effectively, you may be putting time and energy into something that's not going to have the outcomes that you're hoping for. It's a little bit of a disheartening honesty, I think, and it's, as I said, it comes early in the book. But as he develops his discussion more, he points out that there are things that we can incrementally build in. And so that's one of the things I want to emphasize tonight too, is that it's not an all or nothing. It's something that we can incrementally add types of engaged learning to our institutions. So at Elon, engaged learning is part of our mission, but it's also integrated into other parts of the university's identity. So for instance, we in our promotion tenure process, we're required to include and address a teacher, scholar, mentor statement that includes language that connects with engaged learning pedagogies. Of course, that doesn't guarantee learning outcomes for students, but it starts to speak to the ways that our institution values engaged learning, that we can connect to it in our promotion tenure system. And there are other ways that we make those connections too, and I'm happy to visit with anyone one-on-one if you want to hear more about that. We also draw heavily on the work of George Koo and AAC&U's high impact practices, and you'll hear some resonance here between how Koo talks about high impact practices and Moore's discussion of engaged learning. Koo writes that high impact practices or high impact activities demand that students devote considerable time and effort to purposeful tasks, put students in conversation with faculty, increase the likelihood that students will experience diversity through contact with people who are different from themselves, often lead to situations where students get extensive feedback, provide opportunities for students to see what they are learning or how what they are learning works in different settings on and off campus, and can be life-changing. And Koo says this about those experiences. You'll notice that there are some similarities here. We see things like taking the measure of events and putting them in perspective, requiring students to understand in relation to others and the larger world, and then building confidence as well. So some parallels between Moore's understanding of engaged learning and the way that Koo talks about high impact practices. So work that connects to Koo and AAC&U's high impact practices often centers on these 10 activities. And Koo will be the first to tell you that these are not the only high impact engaged learning practices, but these are 10 that have been studied at least a bit, and that we have some, if not strong research on, we've got some practical practical publications about. So we're learning more about them as we go. But he points out that there are also things like work study that may need to be included in this list. And he has even recently said that athletic experiences may fall into this for student athletes, particularly in programs that emphasize the student part. Tonight I'm going to be focusing on a couple of these, certainly not all 10, but you'll hear some references to undergraduate research at Elon, to service learning at Elon, and to study abroad and global learning more broadly. So, and one thing I should say, I wanted to frame this discussion as a what's next discussion, because some of the things that I'll be talking about are things that are embedded in Elon's practices, but They weren't always. And so one of the things that we're recognizing is we need to figure out more about why they work at Elon, and help other institutions join the conversation and join the research into how to make them transferable to other places. And so I'm framing this as a what's next in terms of thinking about transferability to other institutions. So, with that in mind, I'm also, as my title suggests, focusing on productive disruptions. In management and leadership, that tends to be thinking about things that cause creative thinking, disrupt the status quo, that lead people when they see something that's not working or that is counter to the goals of the institution to stop and reflect on it and think about what they can change. The goal is also to lead to new outcomes, new goals, new creative thinking. It's not just a business concept, though, or just a leadership concept. We see institutions starting to enact it. At the University of Washington, for instance, they have a program that they've said their courses are intentionally trying to create moments of productive disruption because they want those moments to lead to creative thinking among their students. At Bryn Mawr, they are using a program that focuses on productive disruptions among faculty and student roles. They want to shift that hierarchy and get students thinking about the authority and expertise they bring, and faculty to think about the ways that they could give up power in the classroom and other learning contexts to embrace the expertise that students bring. And Randy Bass talks about this in an EDUCAUSE article as a potential for where we might see shifts to the core curriculum. And he says that really our productive disruptions are not necessarily coming from external to the university, but they are coming from our own educational movements, our experiential modes of learning, moving from the margin to the center. And this is a diagram from his article. He's focusing on things like high impact practices, experiential co-curriculum, and how they shift the formal curriculum. But I think that his concept can also help us think about the productive disruptions for engaged learning. And I'm going to focus on 4 that have been prevalent at Elon, but give you a sense of how they might shape or impact other institutions as well. So I'm going to look at scaling access, building partnerships, thinking globally, locally, and then closing the loop with the scholarship of teaching and learning. So we'll see. This is not going to start automatically, so let me start. So while they're making that adjustment, let me just give you a little bit of background for this clip. Ashley Finley used to be with the Association of American Colleges and Universities. She was one of their assessment specialists. We talked with her a little bit about high impact practices and what might come next, some of the opportunities for students, some of the things that we needed to think about. And so in this clip, you'll hear her talking about scaling access to high impact practices as a priority. And we'll see while they're making those adjustments, let me just shift ahead a little bit. You good? Okay. Okay. So just as a little bit of processing on this, it may seem counterintuitive to think about scaling access as something that would help embed engaged learning. But when you think about scaling access, you need to think about the key characteristics that will help you retain successful delivery. So thinking about scaling access can actually be a productive disruption because it forces you to think about what are the good things that you have to retain if it's going to be a quality experience as more people participate. And those aren't necessarily discussions that we always think about having, but when we are stop and think about what are the things from this experience that we want all of these students to have, it can make us stop and think, okay, so this is central. This may not be as important. This is something we want every student to experience. This, maybe we can let go.
There's been a lot of national attention given to high impact practices. Certainly the language around high impact practices really engaged learning pedagogies, things like writing across the curriculum, learning communities, service learning, internships, capstones. And there's also lots of campuses that have things that are absolutely high impact practices that aren't going to fit into any list that you're normally going to see. And I would like to see at least two things hopefully emerge from the discussion around high impact practices. What will define campuses in the future moving forward with the high impact practices isn't that they exist on campus, it's that they're done well on campus. It's that they're assessed for their utility, and it's that students have more than one, probably more than two. So it will be a whole new level of campus intentionality with regard to the ways in which these practices are implemented. High impact learning practices have a few at least common characteristics. They always involve high levels of reflection, high levels of interaction, high levels of time on task, doing and engaging, whether that's in big questions or in feedback or in lots of different ways. There will be much more attention paid to the ways in which those are components of the practices themselves, so that we're as clear about our intentionality or why these practices are high impact as we are just about labeling them as high impact. And the other part of it is the scaling of them, is quite simply the idea that we need to know much more about the students who are experiencing these practices. We have some good and emerging evidence around the fact that these practices tend to be actually even more effective, more transformative for students from underserved populations. And we don't know enough from campuses from the disaggregation of their data and actually looking at the disaggregation of participation rates to say who's really participating in them. So we can look more at the transformative impact for all students. So I think what we hope going forward is that there's greater levels of intentionality around spreading the distribution of high impact practices across campuses, so the probability that students will have the opportunity to engage in them becomes higher, and so that we can really say that there's a much higher level of infusion of high impact practices across campus rather than localized in these discrete and special places.
So at Elon, thinking about scale has led to things like in our academic service learning program, thinking about faculty development opportunities to help faculty think about key components like a meaningful reflection that is then integrated back into classroom discussions. For internships, it's led to recognizing that there does need to be a faculty mentor who's helping the student explicitly connect their site experience to their academic experiences, both before the internship and ideally concurrent with the internship. With mentored undergraduate research, it's led us to think, okay, we can't replicate one-on-one experiences for all of our students. So if we really want to make this an option for every student who wants it, what are some other mentoring models, multi-mentoring research teams that might enable us to scale up some of that one-on-one contact without overburdening faculty? So thinking about access and scaling up with the components that keep those high impact, that keep them successful for our students, can be a productive disruption, leading us to think about the key characteristics that we need to fund, that we need to make time for, and that we need to preserve longer term. So there's one productive disruption that I'd encourage you to think about. If you were to scale up programs, what would be the central components that you'd want to make sure were maintained and available to your students? A second productive disruption is thinking about partnerships. And one type of partnership that I anticipate we'll hear a lot about in the next day is partnerships with community partners. And so I'm opting not to talk about that partnership, although it's a very important one. Tonight I want to talk about partnerships with students, because they are experts in learning. They have been learners for a number of years, and they are seeing what's happening in the classroom from the student perspective. And I'm actually going to let one of our students tell you her story. So this is Desiree Porter is in the blue dress in this photo, and her faculty partner in research is Jeffrey Coker, who's standing behind her to the left. She started as a work-study student and then was invited into a research project that grew out of that, which led to a presentation at AAC&U and to the 2 articles that you see snapshots of there. But she's going to tell you through a video just a little bit about her experience.
SURE is an acronym, and it stands for Summer Undergraduate Research Experience. And basically, it's a 2-month experience where you have a concentrated amount of time to work with a faculty member on a research project that you both have chosen to look further into. And toward the end of the SURE program, you are able to present your research, and you may not be completely done, but you are able to present what you have found so far. So it really gives students an opportunity to connect with faculty members, but also take charge of a research project and look further into things that interest them. Working with Dr. Coker, how I got involved was I worked with him last year, just helping him with some tasks he needed done for the General Studies program, and he approached me about possibly doing a SURE experience because we had been looking into the 5 Elon experiences, but just how they relate to other schools and how students are involved with them in other schools. So he just approached me and asked me if it was something I would be interested in, and I actually didn't really know too many details about the SURE program, but I trusted him that if he was bringing this opportunity to me, then it's something I need to look into. So I definitely just went ahead and jumped right in head first, and we started working on the proposal and got things submitted in December, and to my surprise, it was accepted. So after that, things just kind of spiraled, and we started working with students and conducting interviews. And interestingly enough, students responded well to the research because we were examining the 5 Elon experiences and how they related to seniors and their experiences, and it just really gave them a chance to kind of reflect on what they did their 4 years here at Elon. So I was very happy that students found it very beneficial to them, and thus were more willing to engage and help us with our research, so that was great. Well, we are looking into the 5 Elon experiences, and those are basically 5 forms of experiential learning. Students are required to complete at least 1 before they graduate. Study abroad, service learning, internship, research, and leadership. So we're looking into the 5 experiences and how students relate to those 5 experiences, why they chose to do what experiences they chose to do, how their participation led to changes in their future plans or if not, how they feel like they benefited from their participation. Just basically asking students about their relationship with the 5 experiences and whether or not they find them beneficial. There were a lot of unanswered questions, which sounds odd because it was a research project and the intent was to answer one of 3 questions that we developed, but the further we looked into things, there were a lot of unanswered questions in regards to the minority experience and how minorities relate to the 5 Elon experiences and what motivates their choices, and also looking into freshman perceptions of the 5 Elon experiences because our research project, we dealt mostly with seniors, so we were listening to seniors and their perceptions of the experiences prior to completing them and then their perceptions after completing them. So I would really like to speak with a student that hasn't had a chance to complete any of them and see what they perceive they could benefit from each experience. I think that would be really interesting, and also understand how minority students are able to connect with the 5 different experiences. So those are 2 questions right at the top that just came right out of the research after we started looking into some of the student responses. I started to notice that there were a few things that we just weren't able to stab into, granted with the size and the amount of students that we were able to connect with in this research study that we conducted this summer.
She did the interviews with her peers, and they were willing to tell her things that I don't think they would have told the director of the university core curriculum. So just having her involved in the research process, she elicited responses that we probably wouldn't have gone otherwise. She also changed some of the questions. She recognized some gaps of things that we hadn't anticipated asking and helped us think through what else we needed to ask these students. But then also we had her lens on actually looking at the data. And so she noticed things like the minority experience and wanting to ask more questions about that and dig deeper. So she really shaped what we learned from this project. Partnering with students isn't necessarily a new idea. You can see Randy Bass's quote here, talking about if we really are trying to understand what's happening with teaching and learning, we need to involve all the voices, and the student voice is a significant part of that. We do have a growing number of resources on how to do this. These are just 3 of the publications that talk about students as partners, engaging student voices, or students as co-inquirers. But thinking about ways that we can bring students into our research designs from start to finish to better understand their experiences with engaged learning really can have an impact on the outcomes and what we're learning. I want to take just another minute or two on the study that Desiree did with Jeffrey Coker. This is a graph or a figure from one of their publications. A couple of the highlights that I think are relevant to this discussion, they took away from the interviews that it was very crucial to have an array of options. If students only had 1 or 2 options and they were required to do one or both, then they wouldn't necessarily be able to fit it into their 4-year plan or 5-year plan in ways that made the most sense for them in terms of the other activities that they were trying to balance, and in terms of developmentally when they were ready for certain types of activities. So one of their key findings was it's important to have an array, not just to say, well, everybody needs to do this type of engaged learning, but here are some options, and let's talk through the ones that make the most sense for your personal and professional goals. They also found, you heard Desiree say that 1 was required. We now require 2, because part of what they found in this study is 90% of our students were already doing 2 or more. And as they engaged in more of these experiential learning requirements, their job prospects went up, which is something that resonates with trustees, resonates with potential employers, potential donors. Being able to say that the more of these experiences students have, the more job offers they get. That speaks to people who are concerned about the bottom line and the money involved. The other thing that, again, it comes back to the array of options, but students have an array of things on their plates. Even at a school like Elon, where we get fairly traditional students for most of our student population, they still have work-study obligations. They become very active in leadership roles in student organizations across campus. They work in the writing center and the tutoring center. They work off campus. So they have all these competing things that are they're balancing their time and commitments to. And so thinking about when they could do different types of engaged learning. We actually had students who decided not to do study abroad, even though they had scholarship money to help fund it, because it would mean that would pull them out of a leadership activity that was equally important to them. So thinking about that array of options so that students can pick the ones that are the best fit. Here's a quote from their article as well. The part that I want to point out is, again, that similar developmental pathways exist within programs. They saw one with study abroad where students might need kind of a safer space to experience study off campus before they went to a country that demanded more of them linguistically or culturally. But those similar developmental pathways exist within each of the experiential learning requirements if we can think about ways to help students identify them. And I would add that they also occur across pathways. So if we can think about ways that our students encounter multiple types of engaged learning, we can help them build on these different experiences. So moving then into thinking globally, locally. Certainly what Jeffrey and Desiree were talking about in terms of maybe you study in an English-speaking country and then go to a country where you don't, where English is not the dominant language. That also showed up as maybe you do an off-campus domestic experience in service learning, and then you go abroad and do another service learning experience abroad. Neil Sabania talks a lot about off-campus domestic study and talks about it as one of the rich pathways that may have previously been overlooked, but that leads to a lot of the same outcomes that we're looking for in other activities. And of course, his language here is not going to be surprising to service learning folks. We see these connections with service learning quite often. And he acknowledges that overlap. He, in his new edited collection, talks about different types of study away, using that as an umbrella term for off-campus domestic study, overseas off-campus study, for community-based education, service learning, internships, and online education. Still a lot to fit under that umbrella, and I'm not sure that he's fully thinking about all that is encompassed in things like service learning, but I think that there's potential there. We certainly see some overlap in publications like Partnerships, where if you see in this one, there's integrating local and international partnerships through storytelling. Here's a recent issue of the Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning, and you'll see that they're, act local or global. So same types of questions coming up in service learning that are coming up in international contexts. So what I would argue, and there is a third circle there that's not showing up well in the projection, is that we need to look at those common spaces. We need to think about what's happening at the intersections of these engaged learning pedagogies. They are developing separately. They each have their own body of scholarship, but I think one of the productive disruptions for us is to think about the intersections and to ask questions at those intersections and think about what we still need to learn about student learning at those intersections. One last clip, and this is a shorter one, but it's going to touch on the last productive disruption that I want to introduce tonight.
The most basic definition of the scholarship of teaching and learning that I use is that it is faculty undertaking systematic inquiry of learning in his or her own classroom. Every time a professor or a teacher teaches a course, they're engaged in an experiment. The syllabus is a hypothesis that if I teach the class this way, if I teach this material in this order, and if students do these things, then I hypothesize that something will happen. Students will learn, they'll grow, they'll benefit. And that's how we play out every single time we teach. What's missing is that final step of what an experimental mode would be, which is this is my hypothesis, this is the unfolding, and now I have to look very closely at the results and re-examine my hypothesis. So that loop closing happens always in some informal way. That didn't work. I'll never do that again. That was great. I'm always good on that day. Students love this. But we often don't undertake that loop in a very systematic way. So for me, the scholarship of teaching and learning is about taking that last step in the hypothesis testing that every act of teaching is, and picking some dimension, looking at it systematically, looking sensitively and rigorously at the evidence of student learning, and asking if the assumptions that are going into this learning design are correct and if there are things that I might do differently.
When we talk about embedding a culture of engaged learning in an institution, one of the ways to do it is to think about the ways that it can become part of faculty scholarship. And Scholarship of Teaching and Learning offers that opportunity. At Elon, we've seen faculty embrace scholarship on service learning and actually have developed a service learning research fellowship opportunity. It's a one-year opportunity, comes with one course release to support a faculty member who's actually studying service learning in their classes or in other sites across the university and in the local community. And that's a way to extend the faculty development that's already in place and supporting faculty who are further along in their career development with service learning. We also have things like what we call an Elon Teaching and Learning Partnership, where we connected with K through 12 teachers and did collaborative research on learning and engaged learning pedagogies. We also have a CATL Scholars, a Center for Advancement of Teaching and Learning Scholars program that supports faculty research in this area. And as I said, it's also then integrated into our P&T process. The reason I'm lingering on this is because it's a way to fill in some of those gaps that we saw on the previous slide, to speak to those intersections. It's also a way to find out what's really happening in ways that speak to our administrators, to our donors, to our funding sources. If we can say, well, actually, here's the student takeaway, and demonstrate with research what students are gaining from an experience. Or say, well, you want to know why this is worth however much I'm asking for? Well, here's the research to show the learning outcomes associated with this particular program design or this particular aspect of our program. So it serves dual purposes. It helps us continue to promote our programs and do what we want to do in support of student learning, but it also then feeds into scholarship that hopefully will feed into promotion and tenure decisions. One of the things with Scholarship of Teaching and Learning is that we do have principles of good practice. These are from an article by my colleague Peter Felton, but there are also other parallel markers that speak to the ways that we can evaluate Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So it's not necessarily something that has to be secondary to Scholarship of Discovery or Scholarship of Application or other types of scholarship. It can be something that takes a primary role in a faculty member's research agenda. So thinking of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning as a productive disruption, it can be a way to learn more about what's happening, learn more about the student experience so that we can make smart decisions moving forward in support of our students, but it also can be part of a faculty's research agenda and help them make space for these activities. So, 4 things to think about as possibilities. On your campuses, as you're thinking about programs that you're operating, how could you scale access, and what would be the key features that would need to be preserved? How could you build partnerships, including partnerships with students, to gain their perspective and to have them help you see what they're experiencing and maybe why they're picking one opportunity over another, or not engaging with something in the ways that you anticipated, or really engaging with something that you weren't sure would work? Thinking about the intersections between the global and the local, and engaging more at the intersections of those areas, and then using Scholarship of Teaching and Learning to close the loop, to help with assessment of programs, to help us understand better the student learning at each of these places, and keep moving forward with engaged learning conversations. So I'm going to stop there for the evening. I'm happy to give you these resources as well so that you aren't having to scribble them down. But are there any questions?
Is there, if I understood correctly, it's a 2-month, primarily summer program. Is the faculty member or the student eligible for any kind of stipend or anything like that to incentivize their participation?
Yes, so both the student and the faculty member receive stipends. The student, it's supposed to be their primary activity for the summer. So it's actually a fairly substantial stipend and includes the option of on-campus housing so that they don't have to think about a funding source for off-campus housing if they weren't planning initially to stay in the area in the summer. It also includes a couple of community building activities during the summer. So it starts with a kickoff lunch when students can meet with others in their general research area and find out what other questions students in there are exploring with their faculty mentors. And then there's a mid-summer check-in point just to see how things are going. And then at the end of the summer, they actually do a poster presentation, and the broader university community is invited to come hear about the projects that were supported by the program.
Can you talk more about faculty member, as part of faculty development, doing research on service learning? What that looks like? 'Cause in my head, I'm would be junior faculty. You know, how do you cultivate that? How do you, in some ways, make it? I hate the word say like acceptable, but I think there's a lot of hesitancy. What was that?
Something that's valued.
Valued.
Yes.
Yeah. By department or by the university.
And so that partly that's developing a culture within the institution around SOTL, which is why I always speak to that piece as well. But let me give you an example from my own scholarship. Two of the pieces that I did as a junior faculty member were on service learning in TESOL context. So I taught an introduction to TESOL course. We did service learning with English language learning programs in the area. And then I actually worked with students to evaluate the design of the course and of the service learning component. So it was kind of a cyclical effort where students would take the course, and then students who were interested would do a focus group with me about their experience and then help me redesign it. And then students would take the course and do a focus group and help redesign it, and did a couple loops on that, but then wrote with students on two pieces of it, on the outcomes of the redesign and what subsequent students told us about the impact of the changes we'd made. So that was one article. And then a second article just on, because several of the student collaborators were also teacher licensure candidates, on the experience of redesigning a course and what that contributed to their education as future teachers. But the piece, as a junior faculty member, even at an institution that really values SOTL, and at that point, we had just opened our Center for Advancement of Teaching and Learning, so SOTL was still somewhat new as a discussed entity on our campus. So I picked disciplinary journals to focus on for those publications. So both of those articles ended up in English discipline journals that I could point my colleagues to and say, so it's in our discipline. It is using all of our evaluation criteria that we say we value. It just happens to be about the service learning piece of my course. So, And that's a key strategy, I think, is if you can, particularly when SOTL is new on a campus, every discipline has at least one journal on teaching and learning. Several disciplines have more than one. And if you start there as a target, that can often be a way to start building acceptability for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning within the promotion tenure system. Other questions?
Jessie, can you speak to any trends that you see broader than the Elon campus that indicate to you that one type of engaged learning is going to be an easier sell than others?
Oh, that's a good question. Easier sell to who?
Let's start with to students.
Okay. So I would say, looking just at numbers of participation in terms of NSSE data, National Survey of Student Experiences, in terms of some of the other measures that we have available, that study abroad is still the easiest sell to students. I think service learning is a close second, though, in part because if we look at our students' activities, a lot of them are doing service. And so then adding the academic service learning component feels familiar to them. It's still, once they realize that there is an academic piece, it can sometimes be jarring, but they are seeing that connection to things that they're already doing through service organizations, through activities that they were involved in high school, those types of things. So for students, I think those are two of the easiest sells. For parents, internships, because of the connection to careers. Faculty internships can actually be the hardest sell because of the connection to careers. Now that varies by program. In a lot of the professional schools, internships are an easier sell, but in places like colleges of arts and sciences, it can be a hard sell to get faculty involved in those programs. But to look at it from another perspective, we host multi-institutional research seminars. They're 3-year seminars, and we bring 24 to 40 people to Elon for each of 3 summers, and they work in teams to design research about different types of engaged learning at their home campuses. And so we've run one on writing, which we don't necessarily think of as engaged learning, but is one of those high-impact practices. And that drew 150 applications. We ran one on, or are running one on mentoring undergraduate research, 125 applications. Global learning, specific study abroad and off-campus domestic study, 100 applications. So those are just numbers of faculty who are not only interested in this as an engaged learning practice, but in researching it as part of their research agenda and working with other institutions. Now, as we're trying to identify future areas, I would note that service learning, for instance, we feel is pretty well covered. And so that's one that we anticipate coming back to down the road because we're trying to flesh out some of the areas that are not as well researched. Learning communities are somewhat researched, but not broadly. That's, again, not one that we necessarily think of right away with engaged learning, but can take different forms and can certainly share some of these characteristics. And then internships tends to be researched within disciplinary areas, but we don't have a lot of research yet crossing disciplines to look at what are the shared characteristics of internships across disciplines, across institutions, those types of things. So that's a longer answer than you were probably looking for, but so just some different ways of looking at it. Other questions?
I'm adjunct faculty here at RMU, and every time I hear about a set opportunity, I post it on Blackboard, I tell my students about it in class, but I seem like unless I require it during a class time, I have a hard time getting students to go to it. Do you have any suggestions about how an adjunct faculty member who isn't directly involved with something like that could encourage students to participate?
I almost feel like I should defer to the room on that one because I suspect there's a lot of expertise in here, but I will take one attempt at an answer and then encourage you to talk with these other folks. One of the things that I think has been helpful for some of our adjunct colleagues is to really integrate it into the classroom in meaningful academic ways. So maybe it becomes one of the options for an assignment that they can write on. Maybe it becomes one of the options of a cultural campus event that they need to participate in. So it's not a forced option, but it's one of the things that they can do as part of fulfilling a requirement. The other thing is if you can find partners on your campus to help you think about a longer term connection. There might be something that you can build into a future semester that's just integrated throughout your course design and builds on those opportunities so that it feels to your students like it's just a part of the course and not an additional opportunity, which should be exciting, but as they're thinking about balancing time commitments, may be hard for them to prioritize. But definitely ask that of other people here because I think that you'll get a lot of good answers. Well, if you have other questions, please feel free to snag me anytime tomorrow or later tonight. I'm happy to visit more. And if anything resonated with you that you want to learn more about, please feel free to grab me as well. But thank you for hanging out tonight. And thank you also for putting up with my desire to bring some additional voices into this talk, particularly Desiree's. So thank you.